Welcome to the Assessment Accommodations Overview for the ILEARN assessment. My name is Allison Traficanti, and I am the Accessibility and Accommodation Specialist with IDOE's Office of Student Assessment. This overview will provide helpful information regarding accommodations for the ILEARN assessment, as well as resources for you to access. Today, we will cover new and notable accommodations, information about how those accommodations are presented in Indiana IEP, and frequently asked questions about this assessment. IDOE has created a protocol that would allow for students who require a human reader or sign language interpreter to participate in the computer adaptive assessment. Test administrators will be required to follow the protocol outlined in the Accessibility and Accommodations information for statewide assessments to correctly administer the accommodation. The sign language interpreter and/or human reader accommodation must be administered one-on-one, and the student must have this accommodation listed in their IEP, Service Plan, CSEP, Section 504 Plan, or ILP. There are two types of human reader assessment accommodations available for English language arts: human reader except items testing reading comprehension, and human reader including items testing reading comprehension. Test administrators must not read aloud items that measure reading comprehension for students who are assigned the human reader accommodation for items except items measuring reading comprehension. The test delivery system will display a do not speak icon on items and passages that cannot be read aloud to the student based on their assigned accommodation. Test administrators must not read aloud any items or passages labeled with the do not speak icon. Images and additional guidance are provided in each applicable program's Test Administrator's Manual. Test administrators may read items measuring reading comprehension to students who have the accommodation of all items, including items measuring reading comprehension. The test delivery system will not display a do not speak icon. More information regarding the protocol for the human reader accommodation can be found in the 2022-2023 Accessibility and Accommodations information for statewide assessments. To request the human reader accommodation for the online ILEARN computer adaptive test, a student's IEP must state that the student will participate in the online ILEARN computer adaptive test with a human reader, except or including items testing reading comprehension. A student's IEP may need to be revised with parent permission after discussion with the case conference committee to state that the student will participate in the online ILEARN computer adaptive test with a human reader. Schools must complete the fidelity assurance form to ensure test security is maintained at all times. Schools must also complete the 2022-2023 Non-Embedded Human Reader ILEARN Computer Adaptive Test CAT JOT form. IDOE will set the accommodation and tide upon approval. Updated human reader assessment accommodations will be available in Indiana IEP this winter. These JOT forms are also located in the Test Coordinator's Corner in Moodle. Word prediction is now an available embedded feature for students who require word prediction per their formal plan. The embedded co-writer word prediction tool is only available on Chrome OS devices. Students will have access to word lists as they type open-ended responses. As students type letters or words, a list of predicted words will appear. The embedded co-writer word prediction tool is only available on constructed response and essay items. Color contrast and zoom features will not apply to this embedded software. Embedded word prediction cannot function in tandem with speech-to-text. This embedded accommodation must be stated in a student's formal plan. The embedded accommodation is requested through JOT form and set and tied upon IDOE approval. Embedded word prediction assessment accommodations will be coming soon to Indiana IEP this spring. A student who is deaf or hard of hearing may require the use of a sign language interpreter. A student who requires an interpreter to sign content must have the following daily accommodations selected in Indiana IEP: student provided access to an interpreter for sign language, Test directions and content signed to the student hard of hearing. Students who require test directions and content signed must have one of the following assessment accommodations indicated within their IEP. Student-provided access to a sign language interpreter for items except items testing reading comprehension via the online test or paper test, or student-provided access to a sign language interpreter for all items including items testing reading comprehension via the online test or paper test. These daily accommodations and assessment accommodations are now available in Indiana IEP. This December, Indiana IEP will include new updated calculator accommodations specific to ILEARN Grade 6 Science and ILEARN Biology end-of-course assessments. ILEARN Grade 6 Science will include the assessment accommodation student is provided with an online calculator for all items. ILEARN Biology end-of-course assessments will include two new assessment accommodations. Student is provided with an adaptive handheld calculator for all items, and student is provided with an online calculator for all items. To prepare for testing, schools must ensure that accommodations from the student's formal education plan are correctly reflected in Cambium's Testing Information Distribution Engine, otherwise known as TIDE, before testing begins. If the accommodations in TIDE match those in the student's formal plan, the test administrator should approve the student to access the ILEARN assessment. If the accommodations in TIDE do not match those in the student's formal plan, the test administrator should not approve the student to access the online test. The teacher of record should review information in Indiana IEP, making any necessary updates with parent permission after consulting the case conference committee. The school test coordinator and test administrator should confirm the student's correct settings in TIDE once updates are made and then administer the test to the student. When accommodations are missing or do not match what is included in the IEP, first confirm that the current version of the IEP is finalized. TIDE only pulls information from finalized IEPs and will not pull from a proposed IEP. To confirm that the IEP containing the most current accommodations is finalized, go to the Student History page in Indiana IEP and ensure that the IEP is indicated as dark green, meaning it is finalized, and not indicated as blue, meaning it is still identified as proposed and not accepted. For the current valid IEP, click the Details button. There is a nightly data exchange to the testing vendor, so in most cases, the student will be able to test on the day following the data submission if a change was submitted before 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. In Indiana IEP, select IEP Process, then Accommodations to view a list of available accommodations for each applicable subject. Highlighted in blue, you will see the 4 read-aloud choices. In this example, you see that 2 of the read-aloud choices have been checked. If 2 read-aloud options are chosen, you will receive an error message indicating that both items cannot be selected within the same section. You will only be able to check one of the 4 choices. For example, the screenshot on the left shows TIDE settings for a student whose IEP requires the online system to read aloud all ELA test content, including passages and items that measure reading comprehension. The screenshot on the right shows TIDE settings for a student whose formal plan requires the online system to read everything on the ELA test except reading comprehension passages and items. These particular settings are not editable in TIDE, but rather are informed by the student's formal plan via IDOE's nightly data feed to Cambium. Case conference committees and Section 504 teams are encouraged to make consistent, appropriate, and defensible decisions regarding the use of read-aloud accommodations for each student based on locally administered diagnostic assessments. For more information, schools should consult the Guidance for Parents and Guardians, Case conference committees, and 504 teams regarding read aloud for students in grades 3 through 12. Updating accommodations once testing begins can impact test eligibility, which can result in invalidation of one or more tests. Annual case reviews, ACRs, held during the testing window could jeopardize new accommodations not being entered into the TIDE system. Schools should also ensure that students have opportunities to engage with state assessment accommodations prior to the assessment so that any changes to the accommodations are made before the student begins testing. Schools should take into account that a case conference committee meeting is required for a transfer student to occur within 10 instructional days of the enrollment date. This is also true for students who enroll in your school during an active test window. This meeting could also occur prior to the 10th instructional day. Ensuring test participation of any transfer student is also reinforced in the ILEARN Test Coordinator's Manual, which reminds schools to report newly enrolled students and/or update accommodations as needed and in a timely manner. Since student participation is required by state and federal laws, it is important that students are able to participate in ILEARN to the degree possible once correct accommodations are set in TIDE. Schools are responsible for administering the practice test to students before administering the operational test. The practice test is designed to mirror the operational test experience, giving students a chance to sign into the test and practice using online tools and accommodations and navigate the online system. It's also an opportunity for test administrators to practice selecting and approving student tests in the TA interface, assigning designated features, and monitoring students' testing progress. TAs and students should also use the practice test opportunity to confirm that accommodations are correctly set prior to operational testing. TAs should communicate any missing and/or incorrect accommodations to the school or corporation test coordinator right away so updates can be made in time for the operational test. Please note that students testing paper and pencil will not have a separate practice test book. These students will complete the small set of practice test items on the pages immediately preceding the operational test. Extended time is an accommodation available in TIDE for those students whose formal plans allow for this accommodation. ILEARN is an untimed assessment for every student. The computer adaptive test expires at the end of the test window. Students are able to pause their assessments and resume on a different day, but will not be able to revisit previously answered items. The performance task is untimed but has shorter expiration periods. Any student can be given multiple test sessions throughout the day to complete a performance task, but each performance task will expire shortly after the student begins them. The school must determine the appropriate number of test sessions a student should receive to complete one or more test segments. Please review the 2022-2023 ILEARN scheduling and timing guidance for expiration details associated with the ILEARN performance tasks, as these segments expire sooner for all students. Most test invalidations reported to IDOE each year are related to accommodations given to or withheld from students in AIR. The following reminders are based on some of the most common issues reported by schools. Ensure only one active record per student exists in Indiana IEP. Confirm student accommodations are correct in TIDE before testing begins. Administer tests using the correct scripted directions, whether they come from the appropriate test administrator's manual and/or any accommodated read-aloud script. Provide any non-embedded accommodations locally, such as a multiplication table or additional breaks, as prescribed in the student's formal plan. Schools should review the 2022-2023 accessibility and accommodations information for statewide assessments and the 2022-2023 Indiana Assessments Policy Manual for additional details and reminders. The 2022-2023 Indiana Assessments Policy Manual outlines special flexibility and protocols for students and staff who require the use of electronic devices during testing so they can monitor their glucose levels if needed. More details are discussed in the policy manual. The 2022-2023 Accessibility and Accommodations Information for statewide assessments details specific protocols for test administrators when administering tests to students with a temporary medical condition, such as a broken arm or concussion. Every fall, Cambium publishes an accommodations training module applicable for all Indiana assessments. This module is designed to provide schools with an in-depth look at the available accommodations and supports available with each assessment and how to manage and review student accommodation settings in TIDE. Please look for this on-demand training module to become available this fall and reference it as needed throughout the school year. Please contact the Indiana Assessment Help Desk with any questions about this module. The Indiana Assessment Policy Manual and the Accessibility and Accommodations information for statewide assessments can be accessed from IDOE's website, linked on the next slide. Be sure to review each document ahead of testing, as each is applicable to all Indiana assessments, and let IDOE know if you have any questions. Contact information can be found on this slide. Please direct any assessment accommodation questions to the Office of Student Assessment. Resources pertaining to this assessment can also be found on this slide. You can also access these resources on the IDOE Assessment webpage. Thank you for watching the ILEARN Assessment Accommodations Overview. Please reach out to the Office of Student Assessment with any questions.